Good morning, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. My name is BJ Ferguson, and I'll be moderating today's session on behalf of Analyst1. We're really glad to have you with us for this conversation because energy organizations today sit at really the crossroads of national security, industrial stability, and everyday life, which also makes them prime targets for increasingly sophisticated cyber threats. As we all know, the threat landscape facing energy operators continues to evolve rapidly. Attackers are no longer confined to either IT or OT. They move fluidly between enterprise environments and operational networks, often faster than teams can respond. What we hear consistently from energy security leaders, from customers and prospects both, is that the challenge isn't a lack of tools or data. It's really the gap between intelligence, operations, and industrial control system defense. Today's webinar is focused on teams can really close that gap. How teams can really close that gap, specifically how unifying cyber threat intelligence with real-time ICS visibility and operational workflows helps organizations detect threats faster, reduce risk exposure, and disrupt adversaries before they create real-world impact. So during this session, we'll walk through some real-world examples and sector-specific insights, including latest threat trends impacting electric, oil, and gas, and renewable energy operators, how intelligence and ICS/OT security teams can work more closely together, and practical ways to operationalize threat intelligence across SOC, CTI, and OT environments. And really, at the end of the day, how to prioritize those threats that pose a real operational and safety risk, not just technical noise. So to guide us through this discussion, we're joined by two experts who bring complementary perspectives across intelligence and across the intelligence and the industrial security space. First, from Analyst1, we're joined by Eddie Mitchell, who is the VP of Solutions Engineering. He brings deep experience in cyber threat intelligence and helping organizations turn raw intelligence into defensible, actionable decisions across complex environments. We're also joined by Tim Cook, who is the advisory solutions architect from Dragos. He brings extensive experience in ICS and OT security, working directly with energy operators to defend critical infrastructure from advanced threats. Together, Analyst1 and Dragos bring a unique end-to-end view of how intelligence and operational security can truly operate as one. So with that intro, we will jump right in. Tim, I'll hand it over to you to kick us off. But from a time-saving perspective, we have some time built in at the end of this webinar for a Q&A session. But if you have any questions kind of midstream or mid-webinar, feel free to put them in the chat. And if we can get to them during the session, we'll do that. If not, we'll save them for the end. Thank you for joining us, and let's get started.
Thank you, BJ, and really thank you to the Analyst1 team for this opportunity to come together and discuss the importance and value of really OT and ICS cyber threat intel and how we can all collectively operationalize that intel to proactively reduce risks. So kind of order of operations today, from my perspective, I'm going to cover a little bit about what OT threat intel is and really what Dragos tries to provide to our customers, and then spend hopefully most of our time, or my time at least, discussing some OT threat trends facing the energy sector, highlighting some key groups that hopefully everyone on this call is tracking, or if not, we'll continue to track afterwards, and then turn it over to my esteemed partner over here, Eddie, to collectively talk about operationalizing threat intel in Analyst1. So without further ado, if we can go to the next slide. Just always want to take a second to discuss what really OT threat intel is, and why it might make sense for some of the organizations that are represented on this call to work to incorporate OT specific threat intel into some of your cyber threat intel workflows. From my perspective at a high level, and my background is coming from the military, Navy intel. Didn't spend a ton of time in the OT space before coming over here to Dragos 3.5 years ago, but I was really shocked to have my eyes open to just how unique OT systems are in terms of their protocols in use, the vulnerabilities, but most importantly, the characteristics that underpin why they exist. focus on availability and continuous communication to ensure that your critical systems remain up and running, yet designed to be in a network that is segmented or quote unquote air gapped. And the reality is many of these networks, many of your networks likely have remote access connections, third-party, trusted connections, pathways that can be abused by an increasing number of ICS OT-focused threat actors. And so what we try and bring to the table, working with our friends at Analyst1, is threat intelligence that is written by folks who understand ICS OT technology and vulnerabilities and protocols, and work to understand those threat actors and how they look to abuse those protocols. So collectively, we can stay left of boom and take proactive preventative measures. Next slide. Again, just at a high level here, ICS OT focused threat intel and really protecting critical infrastructure is not just something we do. It's 100% what Dragos does. That's our stated mission. And as part of that mission, we do have the largest private ICS OT focused threat intelligence team in the world, actively working on an everyday basis to uncover new threats, highlight vulnerabilities that require actioning, or otherwise have mitigation guidance that we can provide to customers, and then sharing that information across our customer base. And I think more folks are probably familiar with the Dragos platform, but today I want to really lean into the Dragos Worldview, which is our finished threat intelligence reporting system that has an integration with Analyst1 that can really make prioritizing and operationalizing intel that much easier. Next slide, please. As we go through today, some of the trends and some of the most active threat groups targeting critical infrastructure, targeting energy, I want the participants ideally to keep in mind that at Dragos, we look at ICS cyber threats through the lens of the ICS cyber kill chain, which really is broken down into two main parts. Stage one is the intrusion stage, very similar to what you expect to see from a lot of the regular regular IT kill chain, but these are operations that if you're in a IT SOC, you're likely to see. So reconnaissance, weaponization, targeting, delivering exploits, etc. And the intent of stage one is really to enable an adversary to shift to stage two, which represents actual disruptions or operations in a operational technology environment. And what we want to provide and provide our customers really is the ability to understand and detect and respond to threats in stage one as well as stage two. And again, even though we do see most of our adversaries gain access to the corporate enterprise IT environment, we are seeing a trend where threat actors are beginning to target stage two exposed assets directly. So it's important to really wrap your arms around both of those. Next slide, please. I'm not going to read all these words, but as a former intelligence practitioner in the government, and two, someone who works with folks in the industry on a daily basis, from my perspective, two of the most important qualities of good cyber threat intel, and I think Eddie would probably agree with me, is one, intel needs to be made specific or relevant to individual industries or businesses. And that can come from identifying shared victimology. So maybe you're a electric generation facility and you identify another electric generation facility that's being targeted somewhere around the world. Generally, I'd consider that to be something that's relevant. The other way would be maybe it's a completely different industry, but there's overlap in systems. Maybe those are OT systems or exploited devices, but the ability to identify relevance in the constant flow of information coming across our desks is very important. And then the second thing that I'm going to be leading into today is really looking to highlight where intel can be actioned, because intel is, despite what some folks might think, isn't just a news source, something you read that's interesting or maybe makes you a little smarter. We're really trying to drive proactive, preventative action. And that's what we provide in our intelligence reports. And I know Analyst1 helps highlight as well. So let's get into some of the cyber risk trends we're seeing from the energy sector, and I think BJ really highlighted some of the key trends leading into this discussion. But across the board, OT networks, operational technology networks, face increased risk, whether that's a rise in hacktivism activity targeting ICS or OT, a rise in ransomware holding industrial systems at risk. But the energy sector is unique, and that is widely regarded as a high value strategic target for nation state adversaries. So, as such, anytime we see geopolitical tensions increase or potentially increase on the horizon, we tend to see an increase in targeting of energy infrastructure. And some things I want to be sure to call out, hopefully this resonates with folks on the call, is there might be folks from North American utilities, oil and gas, you name it, on this call, thinking, well, the U.S. really isn't involved in any direct hostilities at the moment. So, yes, I recognize there's things going on in Ukraine, maybe things going on in Israel, elsewhere, but we're really at a state of relative peace. And one trend that we recently really dissected in a internal report was we tend to see pre-kinetic ICS OT focused cyber operations follow a consistent path, a consistent trend. You'll see, before actual kinetic operations kick off, you're likely to see reconnaissance and establishment of initial access on the system, pre-positioning, and then an adversary can, with access to a system and pre-position on a system, really collect information, lie in wait, dormant. And those are the sorts of behaviors that, say, depending on what geographic region you find yourself in, I would likely be paying attention to now, because we certainly don't want to wait for the proverbial sirens to be going off to start scrambling and make sure we can't be targeted during a sort of kinetic hostility or with geopolitical tension. The other trend, if we can go back real fast, the other trend just to be mindful of is at the same time we're seeing more threat groups come into the game of targeting ICS OT. We're also seeing organizations in the energy sector have an expanded attack surface. And I mentioned some of those trends earlier, but it could be distributed energy resources, could be remote access solutions, could be vendors requiring access, but kind of the confluence of those two factors is something that I find particularly concerning and really necessitates that we have a good understanding of how ICS OT focused threats operate and what we can do to mitigate them. Next slide, please. So I'm now going to kind of transition into talking about two different groups of threats that we track closely. And I think when I look across the energy sector threat landscape, I really think these two groups are really most relevant for the folks here. And after we kind of cover some of the key TTPs, I'm going to show kind of an attack pathway for VoltSite and how organizations can leverage some of this intel today. So VoltSite, for those who might not be familiar with Dragos naming conventions or threat group, VoltSite is the Dragos threat group that has technical overlap with the group Volt Typhoon. So this is a group that has been attributed by the US government to be aligned with the People's Republic of China. It's a group that stands out in terms of their assessed intent as not a group that's just focused on traditional economic espionage or intellectual property theft, but based on their targeting of critical infrastructure and specifically their exfiltration of sensitive operational information, SCADA documentation, etc., and their intent to maintain long-term persistent access would suggest that they could very well be pre-positioning on ICS OT focused or ICS OT environments to cause potential disruptions down the road, or at least develop offensive capabilities. So very important group to pay attention to. If we can go to the next slide. Some just recent examples of campaigns observed by Dragos of ongoing VoltSite activity. So in the oil and gas space, about midway through last year, We identified the exploitation of end-of-life serial wireless Airlink devices at a oil and gas organization, leading to process control manipulation. And I'd say that, frankly, that's a trend probably worth highlighting in and of itself, is the targeting of wireless management devices to try and pivot it into OT space. We've also seen the compromise of multiple utilities, both utilities near U.S. military bases as well as major metropolitan areas, and continued exploitation of perimeter devices, providing access to defense industrial base organizations. This is a diagram based off of some insight and analysis we were able to gain, actually having deployed the Dragos platform in a new customer environment that actually had VoltSite or Volt Typhoon in it. Just want to really highlight here the attack pathway and what, from a defender perspective, I would be paying attention to and looking to leverage. So, foremost, VoltSite is known to target vulnerabilities in edge devices for initial access. That's something that's not really unique to VoltSite. We also see, frankly, an increase in ransomware groups targeting edge appliances. From there, VoltSite abused native valid accounts to move laterally to a domain server where they began staging and exfiltrating information, and then moved to the Active Directory using RDP lateral movement techniques, where they downloaded a shadow copy of the Active Directory, likely taking it offline to break the hash, and then returned for additional lateral movement and enumeration across the network. But really, a couple things stand out to me during this example. Foremost, what we observed was they gained access, exfiltrated information, and then approximately 2 to 3 weeks into the intrusion were dormant for about 200 days. After 200 days, they returned to the network, recompromised credentials, and then continued their reconnaissance, which likely suggests, one, intent to maintain long-term persistent access, and two, potential further tasking or additional handoff to specialized groups to continue operations on the network. The other takeaway I want to call out is, as it mentions on the slide, we did observe them target GIS information, so geographic information systems, which very much, again, is in line with their assessed intent to understand where assets or networks and co-interdependencies between critical infrastructure might be perhaps weakest. But from a defender standpoint, I always encourage my customers, when we hear about the targeting of specific types of information, that is a prime opportunity for organizations to evaluate and understand what information the adversary is targeting and how well positioned your organization is at detecting potentially access to or exfiltration of that information. And I also want to call out briefly, I know it mentions at the bottom of the slide, the identification of some C2 over a known VoltSite C2 server. IOCs, I would say, are I would not put all my eggs in the IOC for a threat detection basket. Yet we do consistently see indicators that Dragos provide identifying threat activity as that initial threat detection piece on the edge of the network, or potentially C2. And so, very much identifying relevant indicators, high confident indicators across the full range of threat intelligence you have, and then prioritizing those for retroactive hunts would be definitely a recommendation that I would look to implement, and I know Analyst1 is primed to support with. Next slide, please. So, I think, VoltSite really is a good example of a threat that's widely relevant to North American critical infrastructure. Of course, they've been observed targeting industries elsewhere. When we look at groups that have actually demonstrated the ability to disrupt and actually cause disruptions in the ICS OT space, really the two groups that stand out in my mind are Electrum and Camosite. And Electrum is actually the actions on objective group here out of this pair, but they're share some technical overlap with groups tracked as Sandworm or APT-44, specifically responsible for causing disruptions in Ukraine power infrastructure in 2015 and 2016, and also using additional ICS OT focused malware in Ukraine in 2022. And I guess probably worth calling out. Maybe there could be some questions on this topic after the call, but I think a lot of folks, at least in the electric space, are tracking recent events in Ukraine, specifically the stated December 29th intrusion of combined heating and power facilities and renewable energy management systems in Poland. Dragos just published a report on that actually last night that is publicly available, and happy to answer a few questions or share the link afterwards. But kind of a further shows the importance of one, understanding your attack surface, right, with the first distributed energy resource attack, and then also more broadly why it's important to pay attention to threats, even if they're not occurring in your country, because threat actors can be fairly nimble. So that's Electrum. Just a note, a lot of the Electrum activity is observed in the OT space. Kamacite or Kamacite is the initial access broker. So this is a group that I would very strongly encourage all security teams to pay attention to, but particularly those that have purview into enterprise IT environments, because that's predominantly where Kamacite finds their initial access pathways. And we're going to cover some more specifics on Kamacite on the next slide. So Kamacite did enable initial access into the electric grid of Ukraine in 2015 and 2016, and again in 2022. But I think this slide is worth calling out because they're, despite those more noteworthy attacks into electric utility infrastructure, there have been multiple Kamacite campaigns against a kind of a more broad selection of targets. So an intrusion into German electric sector in 2017, more broad targeting of 50,000 devices in 2018, 54 countries, 500,000 devices in 2018, and then targeting of U.S. electric infrastructure in 2020. So it's can be enticing to just follow the headlines in the news of disruptions and assume that between those disruptions, we're not seeing any really advanced adversary tradecraft targeting industrial organizations. But the reality is we see fairly continuous targeting of energy infrastructure, and leveraging ICS OT focused threat intelligence really helps highlight that to give it the due attention it really requires. Next slide, please. Real, at a high level, I want to highlight some attack pathway, items here for Electrum in both the 2015 and 2016 attacks on Ukrainian energy infrastructure for a few key reasons here. So if we're looking here at the 2015 attack, you will notice that, yes, initial access was obtained through spear phishing in the enterprise IT environment that ultimately led to the compromise of valid VPN credentials and then remote access from that VPN into the OT environment. From there, Electrum was able to send valid electric system commands to circuit breakers, opening and closing those breakers and causing disruptions in distribution substations. So the takeaway from my perspective is, as we take a step back and look at kind of the history of ICS OT focused threats, there's a tendency to jump to conclusions to think that adversaries require advanced sophisticated malware to have an impact. That's probably perhaps one of the false takeaways from the Stuxnet malware attack against Iran, right? But the reality is leveraging native industrial protocols and knowledge of ICS OT systems, an adversary can use basic remote access Trojans and abuse remote access tools to manipulate ICS OT devices and cause disruptions. If we go to the next slide, kind of a good slide or a good depiction of some of the evolution of capabilities. So as opposed to the 2015 attack against Ukrainian substations, the 2016 attack targeted transmission substations and sought to leverage an actual repeatable automated attack flow, leveraging the crash override malware. What's noteworthy, from my perspective, is once again we saw an intrusion into the IT network as the initial access pathway here. Rather than abusing remote access solutions, we saw the abuse of a shared IT, ICS or OT asset. So similar to like a jump server, which again is a pretty frequent point of access into OT systems, and is one of the reasons that definitely strongly recommend organizations have some form of network monitoring to, one, identify those shared assets, and two, validate whether or not you're allowing additional unnecessary connection paths into the OT environment. But with the crash override attack, what we did see, which somewhat stood out to me, is a pivot to the data historian, compromise of additional credentials, and then direct access to SQL server, and then leveraging the native functionality of the SQL server, launching an XP command shell, which spawned a command that allowed the adversary to run the crash override malware. So this attack was not as successful in terms of disruption as a 2015 attack, but it certainly represents an evolution of really methodology, and something that we continue to see Electrum build on in subsequent attacks in 2022. But really, from a defender standpoint, my big takeaway would be, one, understand how adversaries are gaining access to IT networks. Two, look closely at the pivot points or potential pivot points in your industrial environment that could lead and facilitate access from your IT network to your OT network, and make sure you have a mechanism in place to detect anomalous activity, whether that's a pivot from a jump host or server to an ICS OT asset, the sending of commands or changing device configurations. Those are all behaviors that you would expect to see in a crash override type attack. And by understanding those behaviors, ensuring you have robust detections in place, and also validating whether or not you allow those connections, you can stay really left on the ICS kill chain and prevent some of those disruptions. Next slide, please. This is really the last heavy intel slide, but this really concerns some more recent Comosite activity, and I think is a noteworthy warning here. So again, Comosite is the initial access broker for Electrum, and they have been predominantly focused on Eastern Europe and Ukraine since 2022. But Dragos did observe Comosite scanning exposed industrial devices in the US from March 2025 to July 2025. And kind of across the bottom of the slide, you see some of the devices that they were observed scanning. So smart HMIs, Schneider Electric Altivar process, ATV 600s, AccuEnergy AXMs, and Sierra Wireless Airlink gateways. So two real lessons here, and I think I touched on one previously, but we at Dragos always encourage our customers to examine threat intelligence with a broad lens. So don't find yourself being a electric utility or an oil and gas organization, or someone involved in renewables looking across the globe and thinking activities happening to someone else and not me, because again, our adversaries are able to pivot based on geopolitical strategic motives. The other takeaway here is, again, I am all about a whole organization approach to targeting or to tackling ICS OT threats. So focus on stage one of the ICS kill chain and stage two. But this is an example of why it's important to have some level of visibility and of your OT environment and understanding of what OT assets are present. Because if Comosite and other threat groups are able to identify exposed ICS OT assets, that can allow them to pivot directly into a potentially segmented OT environment. So that's Comosite. Next slide, please. Again, just to take a step back and hit on some trends, what we're seeing. One, the emergence of new ICS malware that would include Frosty Goop, which targeted devices utilizing Modbus TCP over port 502 in Destroyer 2. But from my perspective, and I know a lot of my colleagues at Dragos share this opinion, it's important to not think that sophisticated advanced malware is required to cause impact in an industrial environment. Knowledge of that environment and access to that environment is frankly the most important aspect. Trend 2, internet accessible OT devices between not just nation state level adversaries, but the increase in hacktivists out there targeting ICS OT. Very important to manage your attack surface and make sure that there is no easy attack pathways, and certainly an internet accessible OT device would qualify. Remote access, we continue to see the abuse of remote access solutions, whether that's VPNs, SSH, RDP, virtual network computing, etc. Understand how your adversaries, what they're targeting, and then look in your environment to identify and validate that you do not have unnecessary exposed remote access points. And then lastly, specifically relevant to the Volt site, Volt Typhoon, living off the land. It's important to, one, understand those techniques, two, have a baseline of what normal behavior in your environment is, but three, understand what tools they are abusing so you can keep an eye out for those, because those can be a good help when you're trying to level the different TTPs together and identify when you may have an adversary as advanced as Volt site or Volt Typhoon in your network.
Awesome. Tim, that was super insightful. Thank you so much for that briefing. I hope everyone on the call found that as insightful as I did. Yeah, so now I'm going to kind of talk a little bit about what BJ touched on at the beginning of the call in terms of like, how do we take this rich threat intelligence related to ICS and OT threats that's being put out by the team at Dragos and actually operationalize this within our environment to really move the needle. And really, this is a common problem that I talk with organizations on a daily basis about, in terms of how do we actually address this, what we call threat coordination gap, where we have all these internal teams, whether it's cyber threat intelligence, incident response, tactical threat monitoring like SOC, threat hunt, et cetera. And these are teams that are all doing very critical, important work on a daily basis. But how do we ensure that those particular teams are operating off the same sheet of music and are making the highest quality threat-informed decisions based on this high fidelity data delivered at the time of need? And so that's really the entire goal of Analyst1, is to kind of close that threat coordination gap and to take advantage of this rich threat intelligence from Dragos and literally hundreds of other individual sources, make sense of that data and deliver it to those particular teams so they can make the highest quality threat-informed decisions and really kind of move the needle from a business outcome and risk mitigation perspective. So I kind of want to show over the next few slides here a few practical examples of how we're able to accomplish that. So what you're looking at right now is a fully customizable SCADA and ICS oriented dashboard that we've constructed within the Analyst1 Advanced Threat Intelligence platform. And so really what these individual cards or tiles on this particular dashboard are oriented to, and I apologize, it might be a little bit difficult to read the title headings on the individual cards. But really what these individual visualizations are aligned to is organizationally defined both general and priority intelligence requirements around monitoring for different threats impacting OT and the ICS space. So the first one, the upper left-hand corner, and this, again, I know it's very difficult to see, but what this is actually showing is this is actually showing trending over time in terms of top adversaries, whether these are adversary collectives or nation state sponsored actors, as Tim was kind of talking about during his briefing, that are specifically targeting organizations within the ICS and OT space, right? So you're able to really quickly be able to bubble up based on threat data that's been collected and analyzed by our platform in an automated fashion. which particular threats should we be most concerned about in terms of like from a strategic and also tactical monitoring perspective. The middle top row, whereas on the left, we're showing adversary groups and adversary collectives. The middle tile is oriented around top technical threats, right? And so Tim talked a lot about, targeted ransomware groups, leveraging exploitation around specific products and vendors, right? That may or may not be part of your ICS tech stack, right? So what are the top technical threats that are actually being currently leveraged by these adversaries to target organizations within the ICS? On the far right in the purple, this is actually drilled in terms of like, what are the top vulnerabilities that are actually being adversaries are actually going after in the wild, right? In terms of targeting ICS and OT technologies. Down at the bottom, being able to provide trending in terms of how are adversary TTPs or tools, tactics, techniques, and sub-techniques actually changing or evolving over time, right? Whereas in the past, were they more focused on, taking advantage of what Tim was kind of talked about, like insecure database configurations, whereas now they're kind of more focused on advanced lateral movement techniques, right? Specifically, again, oriented around threats targeting the OT and ICS space. And then lastly, how do we measure the effectiveness of all these sources of threat data, right? So you can see the largest piece of that puzzle in terms of like where this insightful threat data is coming from regarding ICS and OT threats. The largest piece of that puzzle is obviously coming from Dragos Worldview. They're our premier threat intelligence partner, specifically with regard to the ICS and OT space. So no surprise that they actually represent the largest piece of the puzzle. But for all those other hundreds of individual sources that Analyst1 is continuously monitoring, collecting, and analyzing threat data, where are we actually getting the highest level of impact in terms of like how we're able to operationalize the threat intelligence in our environment to actually move the needle and protect our organization against these threats? Next slide, BJ. And so this next particular slide, again, I kind of talked about how I want to drill in on some of these specific examples of how we're able to take this rich threat intelligence from Dragos Worldview and these hundreds of other sources and actually operationalize this in our environment. So this is one of our premier use cases for how we actually are able to bring that operationalization of threat intelligence, and it's through proactive indicator threat hunting. So this is a huge value add that all of our customers, whether they are in the ICS space or otherwise, right? We're trusted. Analyst1 is trusted in some of the most mission critical environments within the U.S. federal government in particular. But really, what we're able to do is our unique approach to being able to operationalize threat intelligence within our customer SIM deployments, and so not. Traditionally, threat intelligence platforms have essentially served as massive indicator shuttles where they're essentially just, for lack of a better word, chucking large volumes of indicators over the fence into the SIM and kind of crossing their fingers and hoping for the best. So Analyst1 takes a very different, very measured approach to how we approach SIM integration. So not only are we very, very mindful about quality and fidelity, as well as volume of indicators that we're actually pushing into the SIM in order to equip those tactically oriented folks. As I kind of talked about a little bit earlier, the entire goal of the platform is to allow individual operators, whatever primary workflow tool they happen to be working within, allow those individuals to make the highest quality threat-informed decisions based on access to relevant context and timely context. So not only are we very mindful about fidelity and volume of threat context that we choose to load into the SIM, But coming the other direction, what we also do is we're also proactively and continuously collecting summarized SIM telemetry and bringing that back into the Analyst1 platform. And this unique capability allows us to proactively threat hunt that SIM telemetry across all indicators in our database, right? Which can exceed, 7 and 8 figures. In terms of volume. And so really what we're trying to do on the Analyst1 side is we're trying to be, again, as proactive as we possibly can in terms of casting as wide a net as we possibly can in order to identify potentially malicious activity. As we all know, adversaries, especially nation state actors that Tim mentioned, love to leverage infrastructure reuse, right? So a lot of those previous indicators in terms of like domains and IPs are oftentimes reused, whereas the more campaign specific indicators like file hashes obviously tend to be more temporal in nature, right? So, but again, the entire purpose around this is to be as proactive as we possibly can in order to identify potential malicious threats targeting these critical infrastructures. Next slide, BJ. And so the next slide that I want to talk about as well is this is also an area where we find a lot of our customers tend to struggle, and this is certainly not unique to the ICS and OT space, but essentially how do we operationalize threat intelligence to help us better inform risk-based decisions about what particular vulnerabilities are we choosing to prioritize from a remediation perspective. So again, Analyst1 has a turnkey, very, very powerful and unique capability where we're able to, within our platform, automatically fuse your internal asset and vulnerability data, which we passively collect, right? I know a lot of ICS and critical infrastructure vendors are very sensitive around active scanning. So the solution does not include any active scanning. This is all asset and vulnerability data that we passively collect from authoritative sources of information. But then once we do, what we do with that asset and vulnerability information is we automatically fuse or correlate that with the threat intelligence that our platform has automatically analyzed. And so the result is what you see here is of the hundreds of thousands or millions of known vulnerabilities, right? Show me just those particular vulnerabilities, right? That I have one or more internal assets that are currently vulnerable that we know based on threat intelligence certain adversaries are targeting in the wild. And it might be difficult to see, but a lot of these high impact ransomware adversaries that Tim mentioned, like for instance, the Clop ransomware gang, we can actually see certain CVEs, their known targeting in the wild. And oh, by the way, here's an asset list of internal components or assets, whatever they happen to be, that are currently impacted by those vulnerabilities, right? So the entire goal, again, right, delivering the context to the different teams in order to allow them to drive business outcomes and make the highest quality threat-informed decisions about how to prioritize the work that they're doing. So that's kind of a high-level overview, again, of how we integrate with Dragos and how we're able to, again, take their super valuable threat intelligence and actually transform that into business outcomes and business risk mitigation.
Yeah, thank you, Eddie. Wanted to make one call out quickly to the group on the webinar here. The report that Tim had mentioned around Electrum that Dragos just actually published yesterday called Electrum Cyber Attack on Poland's Electrical System 2025. The link to that report is actually in that QR code that is in the upper left-hand corner of the screen. So if you want to scan that, you can get a link to that report that Dragos put out yesterday that Tim referenced.
Yes, I don't know, BJ. I don't know if you want me to talk to this particular slide or Tim. Maybe Tim and I can tag team this particular slide.
I think it's both of you guys. So yeah, go ahead.
All right. Yeah, Tim. I don't know if you want to start maybe in the left and middle box, and I can kind of talk about the last one there.
Sure. Yeah. So hopefully we've kind of established there are unique OT threats, targeting unique OT systems that can have impacts across your organization, and whether that's your, disrupting operations, your bottom line, and really at the heart of it is, impacting communities, national security, you name it. And so Dragos, we provide OT specific threat intelligence, but I fully recognize that probably everyone on this call is juggling intelligence from multiple sources, whether that's internal telemetry, shared trusted groups, ISACs, you name it. And so I'll turn it over, I guess, Eddie on the last part here, but, fully recognize that one of the unique challenges, or one challenge that I should say is not unique, is the need to evaluate and identify relevant, impactful intelligence from the information that's constantly coming into you and your teams.
Yep. Yeah. So just to kind of put a bow on this, kind of getting back to what I talked about earlier, right? The volume of threat intelligence and threat data, right, that's circulating either in the open source domain and even in the private information sharing communities and commercial threat intelligence vendors, the volume is just simply too high, right? And so that's really where Analyst1 comes into play in terms of not just acting as another massive data repository, right, that you then have to manually sift through to extract those higher levels of insights that your teams are, needing in order to make those high quality decisions, but really leveraging the power of automation and our embedded AI and machine learning capabilities to really automatically analyze and extract the relevant information from these hundreds of individual sources of threat data, right? Bubble up the highest priority items based on direct alignment to your specific organization's general and priority intelligence requirements, and then again deliver that insight, that resulting insight, to the different teams in order to enable that business risk mitigation and those threat informed decisions. That's the entire goal of Analyst1, is to close that threat coordination gap.
Yeah, great. Thank you, Eddie. Thank you, Tim. Appreciate that. Now we'll go into a Q&A session here. So questions that have come up during the session will pop up here. I'll ask those, and then Eddie, Tim, I'll leave it up to you to decide who wants to answer or who'd be best to answer.
Of course.
All right. First question that came up was, what automation playbooks are most effective for reducing time to response in hybrid IT/OT environments?
Yeah, of course. So this one, I can kind of talk to this one at a high level. So we have essentially a catalog of automation playbooks, and we're actually happy to provide it if you want to reach out directly to us after the webinar is concluded. We actually have a catalog of automation playbooks that our customers, we've actually seen a lot of I guess, consolidation, or we've seen a lot of common themes when it comes to how organizations are actually operationalizing the threat data within Analyst1 and incorporating that into their existing playbooks or net new capabilities within their SOAR frameworks, right? But like some common examples are being able to leverage Analyst1 in particular as the single trusted repository for basically enrichment actions, right? So previously, without a platform like Analyst1, typically when automation triggers occurred, these playbooks are configured to essentially have to gather enrichment information from potentially dozens of individual sources, but basically having all that data and that insight centralized into our platform allows for massive simplification of these playbooks in terms of going to a single source for authoritative enrichment information. There's certainly other ones. I don't want to like kind of take up too much time, but yeah, we have an entire catalog, and we are happy to share that catalog of common playbook automation use cases, kind of post webinar.
Great. Tim, anything that you would add there?
No, I thought that was well answered. I'm curious. Yeah, I want to hit up Eddie and see what some of his playbooks are. But
Of course.
no, all good.
Cool. All right, on to the next one. How can organizations improve collaboration across cyber, OT, and engineering teams, especially when priorities and risk tolerance differ?
Wow, these are some great questions. Man, all right. Improve collaboration. So again, we inside Analyst1 in particular, right? We facilitate collaboration natively within our platform. Within our platform, and again, I don't want to turn this into too much of a product demo, but basically within our platform, we have different modules that actually are directly aligned to organizations within within different teams internally. So for instance, we have a module of the platform that is more focused around folks or analysts rather that are kind of dedicated more to the traditional cyber threat intelligence or CTI workflow in terms of collecting threat intelligence, prioritizing threat intelligence, providing human in the loop or human oversight into that collected and analyzed threat intelligence. And then lastly, producing content and intelligence products for internal dissemination, right? We have another module within the platform that is more focused around sort of like that OT part in terms of like how we then take that analyzed and curated threat intelligence and actually operationalize that within our environment. So typically that occurs through direct integration with the SIEM, as I mentioned a little bit earlier, but it can also occur via direct integration with different point solutions, EDR solutions, firewall, web proxy, those sorts of things. And then lastly, engineering teams. We have a module within the platform that is most directly aligned to folks that are more focused or playing that detection engineering sort of role. And so these folks are obviously more kind of focused around crafting custom detection and prevention content, managing that content, and then also automating the maintenance and deployment of that content out into the environment as well. And so we have an entire workbench that's built into our platforms that allow those detection engineers to actually build, maintain, and deploy that content directly from our platform as well. So again, Analyst1, just in terms of like how we approach things, we're very, very outcome driven, right? So what we do when we engage with customers is, if you do have different internal stakeholders that do have different priorities, as mentioned in the question, right? We really drill in terms of like, what are the individual priorities and what are the outcomes that these different internal teams are looking to address. And then we align the capabilities of the platform, whether it is more focused on the CTI or the operationalization of threat intelligence or the content production, the engineering side. And then we align the capabilities and the use cases around addressing those particular business outcomes and those priorities.
Yeah, Tim, what about from the Dragos side of the equation? You're actually producing the intel and getting it into the organization.
It's not so. I mean, this is we get this question a lot, and it's very, very valid question. I think from my perspective, one thing that we try and do with the intel as an organization is try and work to get as many people operating on the same sheet of music as possible. So whether that's if you have a Worldview subscription and you want to curate reporting using Analyst1 yourself and present a unified view of like, hey, what's our threat and risk landscape? Or if you want to lean on like Dragos to come in and talk to the group holistically. But generally speaking, if we can, look and understand what the threats are and what risks those are tied to and kind of use that as the why behind, why we might need to implement additional controls or additional monitoring. And I don't want to say put it up on the adversary, but really have a sound, risk-based approach to the decisions being made. That can be helpful versus, hey, they're telling me to do this. I don't know why I'm being told to make these changes when these systems have been running without interruption for 10 years. So I would just say, in summary, really leaning on, the intel supporting your decisions and your desired actions, and using that to kind of all get on the same page for why it's important to take the steps you're doing for your organization.
Yeah, great. Thank you for that. And then I think we have one last question here. What emerging, and this is probably more for you, Tim, than anything, but what emerging technologies or threat trends do you think energy operators should prepare for over the next 18 to 24 months?
Yeah, it's always a hard, projecting out 18 and 24 months, because something I realized early on in my career, no one has a magic crystal ball. I'd say the ones, well, 24 months is a long time. Certainly, again, focused on, like, anytime we see an increase in geopolitical tensions, like, you could see kinetic adjacent cyber operations. And so, we're in 2026, certainly looking forward to, potential conflict over flashpoints in the, South China Sea, East China Sea would be something worth paying attention to. But, I'd take something back to current day where we're seeing a lot of hacktivist activity, some of which is aligned with nation state level actors, kind of doing, drive-by compromises of ICS OT devices. And one of the appealing aspects of hacktivism, even though they do tend to be lower sophistication, is one, they can have impact in industrial environments, and two, they can be used as a means of plausible deniability or misattribution for more advanced actors. And so the trend of more groups targeting actual ICS OT assets, increasing their knowledge of those devices and protocols, whether it's through shared resources on Telegram or research on AI platforms, like that's a concerning trend when you're starting to see not just the Electrums of the world have the knowledge and ability to reach out and touch OT, but you're seeing it more commoditized. So that's some food for thought.
Yeah, great. I appreciate that. I think those are all the questions that we had. So just want to thank you, Eddie. Thank you, Tim, for joining the session and producing some great content. As always, if there's any other questions that follow on from this webinar, if they're more around, centralized around how to make threat intelligence information a lot more operationalized and being able to kind of bring them into a single pane of glass and be able to view everything kind of across one dashboard, and be able to operationalize that. As always, reach out to Analyst1 if you're looking for best in the best of breed energy sector type threat intelligence. Dragos is definitely the place to go. So if you have any questions that pertain to either of those, feel free to reach out to either organization. We work very closely together, so I'm sure there'll be some overlap there. But yeah, thank you everybody for joining, and everybody have a good rest of your Wednesday and a good rest of your week.
Great. Thanks, BJ. Thanks, Tim.
Yeah, thanks all.
Take care, everyone.